Today on Accidental Experts with Bryce Hamilton.
Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're with us today. So we are going to be talking about how to help our neurodivergent kids make friends, because this can be a tricky, sticky area. And I think it's important for us to understand as parents how to support our kids. So Emily Kircher-Morris is here with us today, and she's going to help us navigate this topic. With that, let's get to Emily.
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about kids with neurodivergence and how to help them make friends, because I think this can be such a challenging topic for kids that are neurodivergent.
Yeah, 100%. And it just looks a little bit different for them in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I am a licensed professional counselor. I live in the St. Louis area. Prior to entering my practice as a clinician, I worked in the schools, and so I was a teacher and a school counselor. So I pull from all of that experience in supporting kids and teens in the school setting with my work here in the practice. I'm the author of several books. My next book is coming out in January, which is Neurodiversity: Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices so all students feel accepted and supported. And I am also the host of the Neurodiversity podcast. So those are kind of all the professional things. Just on a personal level, I have 3 kids. They're all neurodivergent. I'm neurodivergent as well. And so, it's all of those experiences growing up as a neurodivergent person, not having a lot of support, not really knowing a whole lot about what that really meant, that kind of brought me to this work in the first place.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. It's so important.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, obviously, I know that there are people who can have jobs that they don't love. I don't know how they get through the days, but yeah, I'm really lucky.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with talking about what does neurodivergence mean? Because I think as we are evolving in psychology, we're understanding that this is such a diverse term. So can you help us to understand what that means exactly?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's important to discern between neurodiversity and neurodivergence. So neurodiversity is just the idea that within all humans, all of us, we have variations within our neurotypes. And the fact that a space, like a group of people, can be neurodiverse. So if we're talking about a classroom, or if we're talking about a workplace, like you can have a neurodiverse classroom or workplace. And that just means that all of the people there, that group of people, have varying neurotypes. And really, this is it's kind of a comparison or analogy to biodiversity, recognizing that we have these variations, that we have these differences, but ultimately that's good. We need that variation. We need those differences in how we approach the world, how we show up in the world, how we communicate, how we learn, all of those different things, because there are assets to it, not just the deficits.
Mm-hmm.
So neurodivergent represents one person whose neurotype varies from the norm. So while the neurodiversity movement really is focused on destigmatizing and depathologizing neurodivergent diagnoses in general, a lot of times we do kind of fall back and looking at some of those different diagnoses. So the neurodiversity movement really was kind of a grassroots movement that came out of the autistic community. And so when we think about this, we think about people who are autistic, but it's broadened beyond that. So it includes people who are ADHD. It includes learning disabilities like dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. It includes things like cognitive giftedness or intellectual disabilities, as well as things like Tourette's and epilepsy. And depending on who you talk to, there are different definitions of what that neurodivergent umbrella covers. I tend to take a pretty conservative view of this because when I think about this, I think it's really relevant in as far as like how people learn, how they think, how they communicate. So when I talk about creating a neurodiversity affirming school, those are the types of things that I'm thinking about and talking about. Some people would put labels like generalized anxiety and major depression under types of neurodivergence. I tend not to. And that's primarily because when you get into some of those, what I would consider more psychological or mental health diagnoses, those tend to be more episodic. They tend to be things that we can treat and that will hopefully, quote unquote, go away. I mean, they might come back. I mean, there are definitely people who experience chronic anxiety, chronic depression, but in many ways, in my mind, that's a little bit different. So like if I have a client who's coming into my office and they're dealing with anxiety, my goal is to help eliminate that anxiety. If I have somebody who's coming in and they are autistic, my goal is not to eliminate the autism. My goal is to help them navigate the world in a way that works for them. That's the affirming piece. So neurodivergent is just this label that means people whose neurotype varies from the norm. It's different in how they show up in the world, and often kind of falls within some of those labels.
Yeah. Thank you for defining that, because I think it does get tricky because we're learning and growing in this space, and it is hard to know. I mean, there's no right, but your definition makes a lot of sense to me of like, it's something that we can't change about ourselves. It is a way of
Right.
that
And
we're,
even like,
yeah.
yeah. And even like things like, for example, learning disabilities like dyslexia. When you, I mean, somebody whose brain is wired for dyslexia, like you can look at brain MRIs and see they actually use different parts of their brain to read, and they may compensate. They may develop new neural pathways. I mean, we have neuroplasticity, but I can't tell you how many adults I speak to when I work with businesses specifically, and people will say, you know, I'm dyslexic. I knew this about myself when I was a kid, and even now I struggle with things. And so I am always paranoid that someone's going to ask me to read something in the middle of a meeting that I haven't had a chance to go through and look at before. And so even though it may not be having that daily impact, that doesn't mean that the neurology has completely shifted. It's still there. There's just workarounds.
Yeah. Yeah. The brain is amazing, but yes, I think there are things that we can't totally change. And that the dyslexia part actually speaks really greatly to me, because I have a husband who has dyslexia, and then 2 kids so far out of my 4 that have dyslexia. And although we've worked really hard to create new neural pathways, I think there are times where they still catch themselves using old tools, right? And it is hard, and do get nervous about reading out loud, or we'll say like they hate to read. It's better now that we've really worked on it, but yeah, it is definitely something that is on their mind.
Yeah, definitely.
So thanks for mentioning that. Okay, so when we're talking about making friends, I think, when we look at just kids and teens in childhood, early childhood, making friends can be hard for some kids, but it seems like kids are maybe more friendly or open to more relationships as young people, right? Toddlers are not very particular. Like, you like to play what I like to play, and we're going to just play that. And if you don't like to play what I like to play, then I'm probably not going to play with you, right? It's a little bit more basic, and relationships kind of evolve, but it can be very challenging to make friendships with people as we age, even if we would be like neurotypical, right? Like, or typically developing. And so when we look at somebody who has neurodiversity and they're wanting to make friends, what do you think can be problematic? What do you notice as themes for people in, the autism community or ADHD or learning differences that do make things harder for them?
Yeah. So it's different for each thing, right? I mean, and so it shows up in a lot of different ways. But I think you pegged it when you said that piece about when kids are really young. They tend to just be friends with whoever's around, right? It's like there's not as much effort that goes into this. As kids get older, those social expectations really do change and shift. So we know, as far as an autism diagnosis goes, there are kind of 2 primary components. The first one is about social communication and relationships. And then the second one is called, it's about repetitive and repetitive behaviors, or things that people do over and over in the same way, and that's not quite as much the one that impacts the relationships. Obviously, it's the social communication piece. And so it has to do with the communication, for example. So I always mention this because sometimes people don't realize this, but in the DSM for autism, if you're looking at that, it specifically states that some of those social difficulties may not really be noticeable until the expectations of the environment are greater than what that person's abilities are. So when you're talking about those young kids who it's like, yeah, they talk, they're friendly, or like maybe they're a little quiet or whatever, maybe we don't notice that as much. But by the time they get to late elementary school or middle school or high school, those social expectations become very complicated. And all of a sudden, that making and keeping friends, the understanding what exactly is expected can be really tricky. So, part of it is trying to interpret. There are a lot of hidden social rules that we have as far as what's expected in a friendship. And so, that can always be kind of tricky. With ADHDers, a lot of times one of the things that will impact them is sometimes it's the impulsiveness or the inattention that impacts how they show up in a relationship. And so, so I'm ADHD. And so while I've never been assessed or diagnosed as autistic, I always mention, like, I was given an ADHD diagnosis way before Asperger's was even in the DSM. So I was never assessed for it, but I notice a lot of those traits in myself. But regardless, like when I'm interacting with somebody, depending on a variety of different factors, my level of fatigue, what time of day it is, all these different pieces. If I'm just kind of like in my own head, it can really look like I'm not paying attention to somebody. That makes it harder to feel like there's that social reciprocal, back and forth. Other times, when the hyperactivity is a bit more prevalent, I'm a bit more impulsive. And so I jump into conversations and I interrupt people. Again, that impacts those relationships. So there was an analogy that somebody used that Brendan Mahan, who's the host of the ADHD Essentials podcast, and I like this, so I use it. He says, the thing about social relationships with autistic kids, it's like it's kind of like playing a game of catch, right? If you look at that relationship or that communication as a game of catch, and so like the ADHD kid misses the ball because they get distracted, right? And they're looking somewhere else and they don't see it. Sometimes the autistic kid doesn't even realize that there's a conversation happening. Like they don't realize like what that give and take necessarily might be. And so those are some real factors. Additionally, a lot of neurodivergent kids have very particular interests that are very intense, which can influence how they connect with others. There's a lot of those different pieces, and then sometimes anytime you have any of these things that it's difficult, and we'll talk a little bit more just about some of those learning differences here that maybe don't directly impact the communication in the same ways, but primarily where kids connect with others is in the school setting. And if you are somebody who externalizes your discomfort in certain situations, then that can be behavior that's seen, that some kids are like, oh, I don't want to hang out with that person because they're always getting in trouble. Well, maybe they're getting in trouble because they're avoiding doing the work. Maybe they're getting in trouble because they feel anxious about these other pieces. So there's a lot of different ways how this can impact those relationships. But I think the biggest thing is also to remember that there's no one right way to have a relationship. A relationship can look like many different things. And we should allow that space for people to have that growth and find what works for them.
Yeah. Well, it's hard because as parents, when you're watching your kid develop relationships and you have more awareness of social expectations and how those conversations might happen or what you think your kid should do. It's hard to not interject yourself into that or have fear. Like, I don't want my kid to not have friends, right? Like, I want people to like them. They're such a great kid. I don't want people to miss out. And so then we sometimes try to like interject ourselves into those relationships to help our kids. what do you suggest on that front? Like
Yeah.
when a parent is trying to interject themselves or hold back, like where do we go?
Yeah. So the first piece is really to step back and do some self-reflection and assess whether or not we are simply projecting our own feelings about relationships. So when we talk about like introversion versus extroversion,
Mhm.
that is a wide spectrum with a lot of variation there. And I've had clients who really truly are comfortable being on their own and doing their own thing. They don't need or seek relationships in the same way, and it's not a negative to them. So sometimes I'll have clients who come to me and are working on things, and either their parents or their teachers will say things like, well, they go out to recess and all they want to do at recess is read a book. And they really need that time. They need to go practice being with their friends and being with people. And my thought about that is, if that is that child's recess time, that should be their free time to choose to do what is going to recharge their batteries. We shouldn't try to force them to go and engage in certain ways. Realistically, with the way classrooms are set up, they are getting plenty of time to interact with their peers in the classroom setting. But it's also fair to recognize that, are they going out to recess and reading that book because that's what they really want to do? Or is it because they have a lot of social anxiety? And so then they're using that as a barrier to kind of protect themselves. And so we would support that differently than we would the others. But what I see parents often doing is they believe a certain thing about themselves, about how they would feel if it looked like what it looked like for their child. And so then they project that and they're like, oh, they must be so lonely. They must be so disappointed that people don't want to spend time with them. And sometimes they're just not. And so it takes a lot of we have to take the opportunity when we can to really talk to our kids, to really get a feel for how they're reacting, continue to give them opportunities to practice, social communication and connection. But also, take them at their word if they really feel like they're doing okay. But it is hard as a parent because, man, the hardest thing as a parent is seeing your child hurt. And, you just want to do everything in your power to protect them and make that go away. And that can be really difficult.
So let's say a kid does want to make friends and they
Yeah.
are struggling, right? So they sit on the bench because they want people to come play with them,
Mhm.
like a buddy bench or something, right? Like, but nobody comes, or they're feeling like no one talks to them, or whatever the dynamic is that your kid's reporting to you. How do we support? And obviously, this is such a big question because we're looking at a lot of different ages in this. But like, let's say early and middle elementary school kids, like how do we support them in that place of helping them with relationships to create them?
Yeah. So I think one of the number one things is we need to move away from assuming that there's anything that is quote unquote common sense. So I mentioned those hidden social rules previously. And sometimes what kids really need is very explicit and direct instruction in what's going on around them. I hesitate to teach kids social skills because I just don't always like that term because social skills sounds very scripted. It's very like this happens and then you do this. Whereas what I really believe is we need to teach social navigation strategies so kids have the autonomy to make choices for themselves, but helping them like, here's how you approach somebody. How do you handle it if they want to do something and you want to do something different? Can you be flexible with that? How can you negotiate that piece of it? How can you handle it if somebody, kind of rejects those opportunities and how do you have some resilience there to handle that and then move, to try to find somebody else. The other part of it is, one of the best ways for neurodivergent kids to make really strong friendships is finding peers who have similar interests with them. And so, for example, I have so many of my neurodivergent clients who are obsessed with Pokemon. And I know more about Pokemon in my head than I ever wanted to know because my clients come and talk to me about it, which is wonderful. But sometimes it's hard when you have those very specific interests and you're in a school setting that only allows you to connect with or play with people who are in your same age group. So
Mhm.
as a parent, what I'll often suggest is try to find those community groups. Maybe it's a scouting group, I don't know, but there's a lot of these little game stores that do some of the, Pokemon things,
Mhm.
or maybe there's a robotics Lego league. I mean, I don't know, whatever it is that your kid's into.
Mhm.
Trying to find those types of connections can be really powerful, and also just broadening our understanding of what online relationships can look like too.
Mhm.
Because sometimes if there's just not a big population of people who have whatever that particular interest is, if we can find those in safe environments online, that can be a way for kids to connect. So, for example, I have a client right now who's super into the Warrior Cats book series. Have you heard of these before?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so they have a pretty thriving online community that's, again, pretty safe. I think they have some good guardrails there so that the kids are not, in a, like, they have some message board capabilities, but it seems like it's pretty a safe environment. And so that might be another way for them to really practice some of those skills. And the nice thing about it is, online relationships aren't in real time the same way when you're speaking to somebody face to face, which can be good for some of our kids who maybe need a bit more time to process or to think about how they want to respond.
Yeah, that's good advice. So do you think, like, when we can we apply that same skill set, do you feel like, to middle schoolers or high schoolers, of like, it seems like it makes sense to find something that interests them, connect them with a group, because I think
Yeah.
one of the issues is loneliness, right?
Yeah.
Feeling like you don't have a place where you belong.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it is the same. And I will tell you though, it's interesting. I've got some clients right now who are adults who I've been working with, most of them since they were either in middle school or high school, and we've just kind of continued. And that loneliness is a really big factor. The more we can do while kids are in the school setting, the better, because even if there aren't kids who are really into whatever their particular thing is, there's just more opportunities in the community for those types of things for kids,
Mhm.
under the age of 18. It's a lot harder, I think, sometimes for these young adults to find those settings. And a lot of times these are young adults who maybe aren't in a traditional college setting.
Mhm.
And so again, if you're in a traditional college setting, then that makes it a little bit easier to try to find some of those people. But you're absolutely right. That loneliness is a huge factor that really impacts the mental health of neurodivergent people if they feel like they can't find that sense of community and belonging.
Yeah. Well, and I think something that I think about in my practice that I talk to people about is, like, it doesn't always have to be at school, right? Like, I
Yep.
like how you said, brought up community things, because sometimes it's like the people that are at your school are just not the best fit for you. Like, you
Yep.
just haven't found anybody, and maybe there is somebody, maybe there are people, but based on your searching, you haven't found somebody that you really connect well to. And so then to have a group where you feel like you belong is just so important, even if it's not in real time, right?
Yeah.
That virtual community, I do love that. Just like feeling like you have people who kind of get you, or just are really interested in what you're interested in.
Yeah. Well, it gives you an opportunity to talk about the things that you care about, that you
Mhm.
love. And so, and I feel like sometimes that's what ends up happening is a lot of neurodivergent people learn to mask that, to hide those things that they're really interested in, because they learn that people aren't interested in them. They don't want to hear them talk about it. And so then they, kind of learn, like, okay, I can't talk about this with anybody because I get negative feedback,
Mhm.
negative reactions when I do. And so, but that's a really lonely place to be. But having somebody who has some of those same interests that you can talk to
Mhm.
um, can be really powerful.
Yeah, I love that. And it does, I think sometimes as parents we think about it being such a big group, right? Like,
Yeah.
our kids need, X number of friends. And I think you have to check in with your kid on that piece of what do they really want. And sometimes they do want 10, 12, 15 friends. Like that's really what they want.
Mhm.
But then also talking about like what's realistic. Why are they looking for that number of friends? What would that mean for them? Right? If they are wanting that. And sometimes when you're an ADHD person, you choose to have more friends because like then it's like, okay, well, I did something that I wasn't proud of in this relationship. So let's give that a little space and I'll come back to that later. Right? Like there's different reasons why we choose different things. And
Mhm.
if we can understand that piece, then we can help our kids like, oh, well, we can talk about that thing to help solve that problem, which actually leads us to the next thing I wanted to ask you about is like when conflicts come up in relationships, I think, not understanding always the social expectations and social norms, right, that we have as a society. How do you help or how can parents help their kids when a conflict arises or maybe a friendship is ending? How can we support our kids in that?
Yeah. I think more than anything, just being there, talking to them, listening, to them, talk through what's going on. Um, it is, I think one of the hardest things about sometimes those connections ending for neurodivergent kids is that sometimes I feel like a lot of times there's this process of kind of growing apart
Mhm.
and they might not pick up on some of those nuances.
Yeah.
So then by the time they really realize, oh, that person doesn't want to be my friend anymore. They're kind of treating me poorly. Like
Mhm.
it's maybe been going on for a while, but they just didn't pick up on some of those little clues along the way. And so then that's harder because I feel like for many people there's a little bit more of a natural transition there where you kind of grow a little bit of distance, here, but then you get a little bit closer to somebody over here. And so, just kind of, helping them navigate that, to how to figure out, where the next community is, who are the next people,
Mhm.
trying to sort out, not personalize what's happened, that it's not necessarily about you, that this is part of how people grow up. Um, but it's really hard, especially for a lot of our neurodivergent kids who really maybe only have one or two really close, solid friends. Um, and then when that happens, it's harder to um, kind of fill that void.
Mhm. Yeah, then the loneliness piece creeps in pretty
Mhm,
hardcore, and if they haven't, noticed it and that friend has made another friend and they were your best friend and now you have no one and you feel like you don't have anybody to sit with at lunch and just like all these things I think
mhm.
can lead any kid, but teens and middle schoolers too into crisis. So do you think like I'm thinking about as a parent, like, if I'm noticing like, okay, my kid and this other kid were best friends, but they seem to be drifting. Do you notice that to them? Do you think you put words to that or to help them? Because I'm thinking like, okay, if I don't say anything and my kid is not noticing it and I could avoid the hurt, but then I also know like sometimes our kids are like, you have no idea what you're talking about, like stay out of this, everything's fine. Like what is your advice to parents in that part of like noticing things?
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna go back to what one of the things I said earlier, which is about just being really explicit and direct is always
Mhm.
best. But at the same time, this might be an opportunity to have a little bit of a different approach where you make some observations, but you don't necessarily assign them a value. You just kind
Mhm.
of notice that thing. So, for example, you might say, "Hey, I noticed that you haven't been texting with so and so as much lately. I wonder what's going on with that."
Mhm.
And just kind of being curious and kind of just getting some ideas because maybe they're more in tune with it than what we even realize.
Yeah.
But just fostering those conversations, making sure that they don't feel judged about it, that like they did something wrong and now this person doesn't want to be their friend.
Mhm.
Um, but also you might just say, you might again make some observations like however they respond to that, that approach where you say, I wonder what's going on with that. And then maybe you say, I remember a time when I had somebody and it was like they weren't replying to my text messages. And, it seemed like maybe they were ready to move on from their relationship. And,
Mm.
just kind of offering some of those little breadcrumbs a little bit
Mhm.
without necessarily assuming what maybe is or isn't going on. But I always think, just the more we can talk to our kids about these things, the better.
Yeah. opening up that dialogue, because I think, yeah, there are opportunities for us to talk about things, but like you said, they might notice that it is happening, and by
Mhm.
you bringing it up, it kind of in a non-confrontational way of just like, hey, I'm noticing this, I'm curious about this, I care about you, I want to know what you're thinking.
Mhm.
They might reveal something like, oh, well, this thing happened and
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with it. And then you can actually be there to support them. Sometimes it doesn't look like solving the problem. Oftentimes it's not exactly that, but asking them like, what are you going to do next? Or what do you think is
Yeah.
the best next step? Or how can I support you?
Yeah. Can we brainstorm some ideas? Like,
Mhm.
let's just make a list of what you might do. Let's talk about the pros and cons.
Yeah.
And again, when I'm in the office and I'm doing these things, I get out my little dry erase board, but you could do it paper pencil. But sometimes it's really helpful to kind of line those things out. It seems sometimes kind of silly because I think as adults, we tend to do these things more automatically, especially for parents who maybe aren't neurodivergent themselves. You may not always think about breaking those things down into the pieces,
Mhm.
but it can be really helpful, and maybe even it's just outlining specifically what are the values you have in your friendship? What are the things that you're really looking for? And is this person measuring up to those?
Mhm.
Is this a relationship that you want to continue pursuing?
Yeah.
Um, and allowing kids to have the autonomy and the independence to make some of those decisions and make some of those changes if they need to.
Yeah. I love that, because I do think that sometimes we feel kind of trapped, like this friend's going to leave me, or
Mhm.
like I can feel them pulling away. But maybe this isn't a friendship that your kid really even wants to nourish, but doesn't know how to leave or how to end.
Mhm.
And so they're just kind of like, okay, they're going to end it and then I can move on and then I won't feel bad about it. Or I don't
Mhm.
know how to say that, or it's really uncomfortable. And so helping our kids through that piece is really helpful. Do you think is there anything that you noticed about kids with neurodiversity that make maintaining long-term relationships harder for them, other than what we've stated?
Um, I think no, I don't know that there's anything different other than it's just harder to find that really good match.
Mhm.
I don't have any idea what the research says about this, but there's a part of me that almost wonders if really strong neurodivergent relationships actually maybe have a longer,
Mhm.
like they last longer than others. Um, I mean, I could see that possibly being the case,
Yeah.
if you really find that person that you click with really
Mhm.
well, like maybe that doesn't change and maybe that person really, through whatever life changes happens and, you go off to college or you do whatever, but you really stay in connection with that person because it is, so tight. So, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not really sure. Like I said, I don't know what the research says. I think it also just depends on the individual as well. Like,
Mhm.
um, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know that there was a specific answer I was looking
Yeah.
for, and not just like curious, but I
Yeah.
also am thinking about, you know, oftentimes we become friends with people and they have friends and then we become friends with those friends and then we're in a friend group potentially,
Mhm.
and we may not appreciate every single person in that friend group as much as we do. Like we may really connect to one or two of the
Mhm.
people, and the other people we're not as deeply connected to. And I think, normalizing that, that's okay. I think it's actually, I prefer in my life to pick the people that I'm going to be friends with versus like by default being friends with close friends with all the people in a particular group if they're not all people that I am clicking as intensely with. And so I like the freedom to be like, okay, I like this person here and this person here and this person here. And then I do things and bring them all together where we're all, friends because of me. That's great. And it
Mhm.
feels the most comfortable for me.
Yeah. I think the other thing sometimes that might happen a lot for neurodivergent, people is that, because maybe it may be harder to develop those deeper friendships and relationships, and so some people are very good at getting along with others, but it just tends to be more of a surface level friendship. So if we're talking about kids who are in school, you know, if you move from one grade to the next grade, maybe you thought you had some friends, you felt pretty comfortable with some people, but they don't persist beyond that environmental shift. And so then you're finding these others and like trying to kind of, blend in and match what others in that environment are doing. And so, that could be another factor that could really influence that type of longevity with those relationships.
Yeah. Well, and with the classrooms changing, right? Like you don't always have the same people. And so then friendships can be very fluid too at that age. And so, you're friends with closest to the people who are in your class because then you go to lunch or go to recess or whatever, and understanding that piece.
Yeah. I read an article at one point in time. I think it was actually like in the New York Times or something. It was actually just talking about adults building friendships. It wasn't about neurodiversity specifically. But one of the things it talked about how one of the key ingredients to building relationships and friendships is having consistent, unstructured time together. So you're not going to necessarily build the friendships when you're just seeing that person at dance class twice, even if it's twice a week. I mean, even whatever. But like by the time you get to high school, if you do marching band and they're it's like you have so much time. It's like why people develop such strong relationships with their college roommates, because it's like you're living in the same area and you have this unstructured time, and that's where those relationships really build. And so for a lot of our kids, when they're in school, you don't have that opportunity to really have that unstructured time where you're just spending time together. And so, I guess another piece of encouragement for parents would be like, say you find some community, groups or whatever it might be where your kids are really thriving and they really enjoy what they're doing. How can you expand on that to make sure that they're not just showing up when the event starts and ends? That's a very structured event, and helping them find that unstructured time where they just get to interact, be themselves, and foster those deeper relationships.
Yeah. Well, it just made me think of, excuse me, Boy Scouts, and like you do the camp outs, right? And so then it's like, yes, there are structured things like your troop meetings and whatever, but then you go to these camp outs and there's, time until you fall asleep, and right. Like, and those are where those conversations are going to be had, those deep relationships, or you're driving in the car, right? Like that time, or having a play date, or, I oftentimes teenagers, whether they have any diversity to them, neurodiversity to them or not, I am thinking about, they're like, well, what are we going to do? And I'm like, just hang out. And they're like, that's so weird. And I'm like, no, actually, it's not so weird. Like, it's lovely. Like, then you have to find something to do. So then you're like, hey, you want to play Frisbee? And it's like,
put the phones away though. You got to put the phones away because it takes up all that space. It's like I can be around somebody and sitting on my phone and really not be near them and with them at all.
Yeah, in proximity, maybe, but not, developing that piece of relationships. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And it is hard, right? The phone is kind of a buffer. It protects us from those really uncomfortable situations. Like you can pull out your phone and pretend you're doing something on it, even if you're not, right? Like, or play a game that you don't even like, but to avoid that piece of being uncomfortable. But I think as a society, we need to encourage our kids to be uncomfortable, to try things that are out of our comfort zone, to do something new or different, talk to somebody, ask them to hang out, ask them to do something together, even if it is a structured thing, like, hey, let's go find Pokemon here. I heard there's a hot spot, right? Like, let's go search for them there, because that's something that's interesting them. But I think our kids sometimes need help with ideas of what to do. True. And I've gotten a lot of, in my practice, teenage boys to make cookies together, which they're always like, no, that's so weird. We would never do that. I'm like, this is a great skill. Like, think about how many people would be impressed with you being able to make cookies. This is invaluable. And eventually I've had some take me up on it. And then since those took me up on it, then I can say, hey, I had these other people who did it and it worked out really well. And everybody likes cookies, right? It doesn't have to be, but it's funny to watch them problem solve and do all those things. And even though it's structured, it's still unstructured. There's still time to kind of talk. Although
they're managing the time on their own, like they're doing it, but they're doing it together. They're engaging with each other. I think structured is also a lot about who's in charge of structuring that. Like kids might get together and they might want to play a board game. They might want to do a role play game or whatever. So that technically is structured, but if they're the ones deciding it and doing it, then it serves that same purpose.
Yeah. And one other thing that I was just thinking about as we're talking is sometimes I will suggest to kids and parents to keep the time shorter, right? Like to not have these really long events together, because sometimes that long time actually leaves on a sour note. And so leaving with a really positive experience, keeping it short and sweet is actually very valuable. And so then, the kids enjoy it. They want to come back together. It's just the right amount of time. And for every kid, that's a different amount of time. So it's hard to say exactly what that is, but you kind of know when things are starting to go south. Like my kids can hang out with some people for hours. Like they could have 2 sleepovers together or something, right? Like where it's like, that is really a good thing. But then other relationships, it's like, an hour is perfect. And so just noticing that and helping your kid to decide on that information, but presenting it to them.
Yeah. Yeah. My mom always used to say, leave them laughing.
I love that. Yes, right? Because then it's like you want to do it more. It's so positive. Okay, so as we conclude this awesome interview, tell me, like, what do you want parents to take away from this conversation?
Yeah. It's okay to let your kids take the lead with some of these things. And it's okay to recognize that their trajectory for whatever their social relationships may or may not be might vary from the norm. It might not look exactly like their same age peers, and that's okay. We don't need to try to rush it, but we want to continue to provide opportunities and listen to them, and recognize that, they'll find the relationships that are meaningful to them, as long as we keep presenting the opportunities for them to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for this conversation. It's been great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks again, Emily. That was all really helpful information. I think what I'm taking away from this in terms of my own kids is relationships are going to look different for everybody. And it may not be what we are most comfortable with. And that's okay, as long as our kids are doing okay. And if they're not okay with that, we can support them in finding and navigating until they find their space where they are feeling comfortable. With that, I will say thank you so much for your time today. Please rate and subscribe to our show. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. And also keep the emails coming with future topic show suggestions to accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Have a wonderful day.
Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.